Illyra Vale was dragged into the great hall of the Bloodmoon Crown with a silence collar locked around her throat. The hall was full that morning, fuller than most trials drew, because word had already spread through the palace that the accused could not speak in her own defense, and there was a particular kind of appetite in a court for a trial with no risk of rebuttal. The collar was silver black, thin as a ribbon, and it sat against her skin the way a brand sits against skin that has already stopped fighting it. The nobles in the gallery looked at her the way a court looks at someone already convicted, not someone waiting to be judged. Guards had walked her the length of the hall with a grip on each arm, not because she had resisted, but because it made a better picture for the gallery to see her handled that way. Lord Varric stood at the front of the hall with a document in his hand, and he read the charge aloud before Illyra had even reached the center of the floor. Treason. Communication with a rival pack. Evidence of a confession, signed and sealed. His voice carried easily to every corner of the hall, the voice of a man who had given this exact speech, in one form or another, more times than anyone watching him that day would ever know. He held up the confession document so the gallery could see it, a single sheet with a dark thumbprint pressed into the wax at the bottom. Her own mark, he said. No court needs more than that. Illyra could not answer him. She could not answer anyone. She reached the small table set before the dais, and with what strength she had left in her hand, she dragged one fingernail across the wood, carving 2 words into the grain. Not mine. A guard's boot came down over the letters and scraped them into splinters before Alpha King Chaol Draven's eyes had finished moving toward the table. Lady Seraphine, standing near the dais in the pale robes of the court's acting Luna, a title granted by council appointment rather than any mate bond, smiled at the gallery and then at Illyra. Sing your confession for us, little mute, she said, if you can. The hall laughed. It was not a loud laugh. It was worse than loud, a low ripple of amusement that moved through nobles who had already decided this trial was a formality. Inside Chaol, Riven growled, low and constant, a sound with no words in it, only refusal, pacing some inner distance Chaol alone could feel, straining toward a door neither of them could see yet. Chaol did not laugh. He told himself that mattered. He told himself that standing silent while a court laughed at a girl who could not defend herself was different from laughing himself. And he believed it long enough to keep his hand still at his side instead of raising it to stop the sound. He trusted the document. It had passed through 3 levels of council review before reaching him. He trusted the seal on it, the signatures beneath it, the weight of procedure that had brought it this far. He had learned, over years on this throne, to treat a properly stamped document the way other men treated a witness they respected, and it had never once occurred to him that the stamps themselves could be the lie. He did not ask why a girl who could not speak had produced a signed confession. He did not ask why no one else in the hall seemed troubled by that question either. Varric pressed forward before the silence could stretch into doubt. A kingdom cannot wait for a mute girl to deny treason, he said. The evidence stands. I ask the crown to rule. Chaol raised his hand to speak the sentence. He did not hate Illyra. That was true, and it would remain true through everything that followed. But he had let a system that did hate her speak in law's place, and in the space between his raised hand and the words he was about to say, that difference had not yet mattered to anyone in the hall but her. The Bloodmoon Crown, resting on its dais above him, began to shake. Not violently. A tremor, deep in the stone, like something old drawing one sudden breath. A voice broke out of it, cracked and trembling, but unmistakably a young woman's, unmistakably alive. She is not guilty. It was Illyra's voice. The hall went utterly silent. Chaol's hand did not finish its motion. It simply stopped, halfway through the gesture that would have ended her life, and for the first time all morning, he looked at Illyra, the way a person looks at something they had refused to see clearly until it was nearly too late. Seraphine recovered first, the way she always did. Witchcraft, she said. The crown does not speak. Someone has corrupted it. Varric's voice came fast behind hers. All the more reason to end this now, before whatever profane thing has touched the throne spreads further. Kale lowered his hand. The trial is stayed, he said, until I understand what I just heard. He turned from the throne and walked down to where Alira stood, past guards who did not know whether to stop him. He asked her directly, the first person in that hall who had thought to. Can you speak? Alira opened her mouth, and the sound that came out was not a word. It was a strangled attempt at one, cut off the instant it took shape, and the collar around her throat tightened visibly, a thin line of blood welling at its edge where silver met skin. Kale saw it happen in real time, the collar answering her intention to speak with pain instead of sound, and understood, finally, that her silence had never been a choice. Healer Mara was summoned within minutes. She examined the collar with careful hands and grim focus, tracing the runes worked into its inner edge, tilting Alira's chin gently toward the light to see the full pattern of the metal. It was old work, older than anything Mara had trained on, and it took her a long moment of tracing the runes with one finger before she understood what she was looking at. This lacks intentional speech, she said. Breath, coughing, sounds of pain, all of that passes through untouched. But anything she means to say, anything shaped like testimony, the collar seizes it before it can leave her throat. She looked up at Kale. This girl was never born mute. Someone built this to make her that way, she added, quietly, that the crown's single sentence had likely cost Illyra everything the collar allowed her voice bond to spend. Whatever the crown had done, it had reached her through a connection the collar had not fully closed, and it would not speak again on its own. Talia, one of the prison scribes, pushed forward through the guards, with a folded page clutched against her chest. She had been standing near the back of the hall since the trial began, and she had spent every minute of it deciding whether she had the courage to do what she was about to do. I have her interrogation draft, she said, the real one before it was rewritten. She unfolded it with shaking hands. Buried in Alira's own cramped, desperate handwriting from days before, 2 lines stood out from everything around them. Not mine. They took my hand. Talia produced a second document, a prison medicine log, and pointed to an entry time-stamped hours before the confession's official signing. A sedative was administered, she said, before the thumbprint was ever taken. Kale took both pages and read them slowly, and somewhere beneath the growing weight of what they meant, a smaller, colder fact surfaced in his memory. Confession documents in this kingdom did not require an independent witness. He had signed the decree that allowed that. Years ago, folded into a longer piece of legislation he had trusted his counsel to have reviewed properly. He remembered signing it in an afternoon, one document among a dozen others waiting for his seal, and remembered thinking nothing more of it than that his advisors had already done the reading he was too pressed for time to do himself. He had not read that clause himself. Alira, still unable to speak, reached for a piece of chalk from a nearby scribe's table and drew instead, her hand unsteady but deliberate. A crescent moon, broken along one edge, beneath it a line like a wave, like a voice given shape. She had seen the mark once before, faint and half forgotten, scratched into the underside of a drawer in her family's old home, and had never known what it meant until this moment gave it a name. Mara studied the mark and went pale. That isn't a witch's sign, she said. That mark predates the court's laws on witchcraft entirely. That's the mark of the Crown Witness line, the office the old stories called the Hidden Prophet, not because they saw the future, because they heard a false oath for what it was. I only ever read of it in half-burned records. I didn't know it still had living blood. Riven, inside KL, went suddenly and completely still, the way a wolf goes still not from fear but from recognition, and KL felt that stillness settle through his own chest, like something finally slotting into place. KL, hearing the words, Crown Witness for the first time, ordered the prison archive opened, a room he realized standing at its threshold he had never once entered in his entire reign. The door had not been locked against him. It had simply never occurred to him. in years of receiving tidy summaries from Varric's office, that the room behind those summaries might tell a different story than the paper did. Elira moved through the shelves with a desperate, focused urgency, searching for something she seemed to already know was there, her fingers running along spines and case tags faster than Kale could read them. She found it in the shape of 3 sealed cases, each stamped with the same silence collar mark, burned faintly into the record's edge. The first was a prisoner who had been fitted with a collar the night. Before signing a confession, no one had witnessed him give freely. His case closed within a week. No appeal recorded, no independent testimony ever sought. The second was a woman stripped of her registered voice years earlier. Her testimony discarded on a technicality before anyone had bothered to hear what she was trying to say, the file noting only that her claim had been ruled inadmissible and nothing more. The third case made Elira's hands go still over the page. Calum Vale, her brother. He had gone looking for records of the hidden profit line years before, certain the collar system hid something the court did not want found, and he had been convicted of treason for it before he ever got the chance to prove anything at all. She remembered the night he was taken, remembered being told he had confessed, remembered believing it because she had been too young then to know what a confession could be built from. Kale read the name over her shoulder and felt the full shape of what he had allowed settle into him at last. I called it procedure, he said, because I was afraid to admit it was silence wearing the shape of law. He said it quietly, not for the gallery, though half the hall heard it anyway. It was the first sentence all day that had cost him something to say. He had not built Varric's system, but he had signed its renewals, accepted its summaries without reading past their first page, and never once walked into the room where its cost was kept. Elira's hand tightened around her brother's file. Something in her wanted, more than she had wanted anything in years, to call the crown down on the entire hall at once, to let every oath seal in the room ignite together and drag every complicit soul into the same judgment that had taken Calum from her. Mara saw the look on her face and stepped closer, speaking low and urgent. A mass judgment does not separate the ones who built this from the ones who were forced to sign it, she said. It will take the scribe who was threatened the same as the man who threatened her. It will not know the difference between a guard who was lied to and the one who told the lie. Varric, sensing the room's balance shifting, moved to close the only door still open to him. She has no registered voice, he announced to the hall. By the very decree this court upholds, an unregistered voice has no standing to call the crown as witness. The collar that silenced her is, in the eyes of the law, still valid. It was a closed circle by design. The collar had taken her voice. The decree said a voice was required to challenge anything, including the collar itself. Varric delivered the argument with the same calm he had used to read the original charge, as though pointing out an unfortunate but unavoidable fact of law rather than a trap he had built with his own hand. Several of the older lords in the gallery nodded slowly, the particular nod of men who preferred a tidy rule to an uncomfortable truth. Seraphine, perhaps sensing which way the hall was beginning to lean, tried to soften her own position without abandoning it entirely. Silence collars keep this court stable, she said. I have seen confessions that troubled me before. I told myself the system held for a reason larger than my doubts. She did not say she had signed her Luna seal onto 3 of those confessions anyway, though the record in Talia's hands would say it for her soon enough. She had been trained since girlhood to speak beautifully for this court, to fill a room with a voice everyone wanted to hear, and it had never once occurred to her that the same court had built a machine to make sure other voices were never heard at all. Kale had heard enough of the circle Varric was building. No one in this hall loses standing to testify, he said, because they were collared, sick, injured, poor, unregistered, or silenced by any means at all. That order stands immediately, pending permanent law. It was not mercy extended only to Elira. It was a door forced open for anyone the old decree had ever shut out, and it was the first order of his reign he issued without waiting for a council vote to confirm it first. Varric opened his mouth to object to the overreach of it, and closed it again when he saw how few of the older lords were willing to back him this time. Alira pressed her palm against the crescent mark, still chalked on the floor, and the collar at her throat cracked along one seam, a thin line of light escaping where silver had held for years. She felt it give the way a held breath finally releases, a pressure at her throat, easing just enough to let something smaller than a sentence through. Her voice came back in a broken, raw fragment, quiet enough that the whole hall leaned forward to catch it. How many did you silence before me? No one answered her, and the silence that followed was not the same silence the hall had laughed through an hour earlier. This one had weight. This one had names in it. Alira looked slowly around the gallery, at every face that had smiled when Seraphine mocked her, and let the next words come out steadier than the first. You never listened to my silence, she said. You only listened to the lie you put inside it. No one in the hall answered that either. Talia stepped forward instead, and her voice shook harder than Alira's had. I changed one line in her interrogation record, she said. Varric told me what to write. I was afraid of what would happen if I refused, so I wrote it his way instead of hers. She looked at Alira, not at Varric, when she said the rest. I changed one line because I was afraid. She lost her voice because I was afraid. I will not let fear write the rest of this. The hall around the throne began to reorganize itself without anyone announcing it, the gallery drawing back, the guards repositioning, until what had begun as Alira's trial had quietly become something closer to the reverse of one. Chaol stepped down from the dais and stood below it, rather than above it, a king choosing, for the first time in his reign, to stand at the level of the thing being tested, rather than the one doing the testing. Inside him, Riven lowered his head, not as a mate answering a bond, but the way a wolf yields to something older than the pack itself, and Chaol understood the difference without needing it explained. The Bloodmoon Crown, answered Alira's returning voice, the way it had answered nothing else that morning. Every oath seal pressed into the walls and floor of that hall began to glow at once, faint gold light rising from stone that had held those oaths silent for years, threading up through the pillars, like veins catching fire one at a time. It was the shape of a mass judgment forming, ready to seize every sealed name in the room, the instant Alira called it. She looked at Callum's file, still folded in her hand, the edges soft from years of no one ever opening it again. She looked at Varric, at Seraphine, at every noble who had laughed an hour earlier, and had not stopped smiling until the crown itself contradicted them. She thought of every year she had spent believing her brother a traitor, because a court had told her so, and of every year he had spent paying for a crime that had never belonged to him. For one long moment, the temptation to let all of it burn together was the loudest thing in the room, louder even than the crown's own light humming along the seals. Then she spoke, and her voice, though still raw, did not waver. I will not let your false trials teach my voice to become another one. The light along the seals dimmed back to a low, waiting glow instead of igniting, and Alira began laying evidence on the table before the throne instead, one piece at a time, each one set down with the deliberate care of someone who understood that this moment, unlike the one that had opened the day, was going to be built to hold. The silence collar itself, its runes exposed, laid flat so every noble in the gallery could see the make of it for themselves. The confession document, thumbprint smudged at an angle no willing hand would have made, the kind of smear that came from a hand being pressed rather than pressing. Talia's interrogation draft, the true words beneath the altered ones, the ink of the crossed-out line, still visible if anyone leaned close enough to look. The prison medicine log, its sedative entry, time-stamped hours before the mark was taken. In a hand Talia confirmed under oath as the prison physician's own. The registered voice decree. The clause Chaol had signed without reading in full. The paragraph in question underlined in Alira's own unsteady hand. Seraphine's own Luna seal, pressed onto records that did not match what she had privately doubted. 3 case numbers circled beside her signature. 3 sealed cases from the archive. each bearing the same collar's signature, set side by side, so the pattern read itself, without anyone needing to explain it aloud. And the guard who had handled the confession that morning, brought forward under oath, at Cale's own order, standing rigid before the throne, with nowhere left to look but at the crown itself. The crown responded to each piece in turn, its light, settling over the evidence and confirming, without narrating, without inventing anything, the proof itself did not already carry. The collar had been fastened the night before the confession, not after. The sedative had entered Ailira's blood before her hand had ever touched the wax. The seal wax on the confession bore a maker's mark, traced to Varric's own private chamber. The guard who had pressed her thumb into that wax had done so while she was unconscious, his own hand guiding hers. Talia's draft matched the timeline of every other confirmed fact in the room. The 3 old cases bore the identical collar signature, proof of a pattern reaching back years before Ailira had ever been dragged into this hall. The Crown did not accuse anyone by name in a sweeping verdict. It simply confirmed, layer by layer, until the pattern could no longer be denied by anyone standing in the room. Seraphine's Luna seal cracked across its center as the Crown's light passed over her name in the record. It did not break, because she had never truly been Luna. It broke because she had used the authority of that office to certify judgments she had privately known were built on lies 3 separate times to protect a position she was afraid to lose. For a moment, she looked as though she might argue it, might reach for the same practiced grace that had always carried her through a room. Then she simply let her shoulders drop, as if some smaller, truer version of herself had been waiting a long time for permission to stop performing. She did not argue when the Crown stripped her of the right to certify judicial seals. She simply stood very still, the broken bracelet-shaped seal cooling in her palm, and said nothing in her own defense. Varric tried once more to hold the room, his voice pitched to carry the same authority it always had, though something in it had begun to fray at the edges. "Truth is dangerous," he said, "when it can speak without permission." Ailira answered him without hesitation, her restored voice steady now in a way it had not been minutes earlier. "Then it was never truth you served. It was permission." The words landed harder in the silence than any shout could have. The Crown turned its light on Varric's own oath seal last, the one binding him to the Council's founding law, and it did not need Ailira to accuse him of anything further. The seal answered for itself, confirming what the original amendment draft, produced from the Council archive and bearing Varric's own private seal in the margin, had already shown in his handwriting, that he had authored the very clause in the registered voice decree that stripped standing from anyone without a registered voice, specifically to prevent the hidden prophet line from ever calling the Crown to testify again. It confirmed, too, the maker's mark on the confession's wax seal, tracing it directly back to a chamber only. Varric held the key to, and the guard's own testimony, given under the Crown's oath-bound light, that he had been ordered to press Ailira's thumb to the wax, while she lay unconscious from the sedative in her blood. Piece by piece, the room stopped needing to be convinced. The oath burned away from his signature in front of the entire hall, the parchment curling at its edge, as though something in it had simply stopped being able to hold a lie any longer. Cale did not wait for a formal sentencing to begin correcting what stood in front of him. He voided Ailira's conviction on the spot, striking the seal from the confession document with his own hand while the hall watched. He ordered Varric taken into custody before the man could finish protesting the legality of his own unraveling, his voice carrying none of the hesitation it had carried at the start of the trial. He suspended Seraphine's judicial seal indefinitely, pending a fuller accounting of every record she had certified, though he stopped short of ordering her removed from the hall entirely, a distinction Seraphine herself seemed to notice. He froze every conviction in the kingdom that carried a silence collar's signature, pending review, a single order that would, in the weeks ahead, reopen dozens of cases no one in that hall had thought about in years. He sealed the prison archive under royal guard, not to bury what it held this time, but to keep it safe until every case inside it could be read properly. The Bloodmoon Crown settled into stillness above them all, its light fading back into ordinary stone, and beneath it, carved briefly into the air in a script only Mara recognized. 3 words held for a moment before dissolving. Illyra Vale, Crown Witness Rescord. Cale did not appoint her to anything. He understood, standing there, that the crown had not created a title for her. It had simply confirmed one that predated his own family's claim to this throne. In the weeks that followed, he turned that confirmation into public law. Silence collars were banned from any trial in the kingdom, and every collar already in use was ordered removed and destroyed under Mara's supervision, its runes recorded once, and then broken, so the design could never be recovered. Confession documents were required to carry an independent witness before they could be entered as evidence anywhere. A single line of law that closed the exact gap Varric's system had lived inside for years. The right to testify was made explicitly available to anyone regardless of speech, illness, poverty, or registration status, closing the exact circle Varric had once used against Illyra. The office of Crown Witness was restored into standing law, with the explicit right to call the Bloodmoon Crown into any oath-bound trial, including one where the person being questioned wore the crown itself. Cale read every clause of the new law aloud to the full council before it was sealed, the way he had never once read the decree that started all of this, and made a point of doing so publicly, so that no one in that hall could later say they had not understood exactly what they were agreeing to. Cale told Illyra, once the hall had emptied, that the crown had given her back her voice. She corrected him, quietly but without softness. No, she said, the crown only returned what the court had stolen. I will not spend this voice becoming the throne's mouthpiece instead of my own. He did not argue the point, and he did not try to turn the moment into an apology large enough to erase what had happened to her. He had learned, at least, that much. Instead, days later, he found her outside the hall and handed her a thick folder of old case files. The ones the archive had kept, sealed the longest. Tell me which case you want opened first, he said. I will listen before the crown has to. It was not a proposal. It was simply the first time in the entire ordeal that he had offered to listen to her before anything forced him to, and Illyra understood exactly how much that smaller thing was worth. She took the folder without promising him forgiveness, because he had not asked for it. What passed between them instead was smaller and harder to earn. The fact that he had come to her first this time, instead of waiting for the crown to force his hand. In the days that followed, Illyra opened Caelum's case herself, with Talia beside her, and Mara reviewing every page for anything the collar system might still be hiding. It would take months to clear his name in full, but the first document restoring his standing was signed within the week, and Illyra read it aloud to an empty cell that no longer held anyone, because that was the only way she knew how to give the moment back to him. Illyra stood in the great hall, afterward the silence collar gone from her throat for good, the marks it had left already beginning to fade. Above her, the Bloodmoon Crown sat quiet on its dais, the way it had sat quiet for centuries before that morning. This time, the silence in the hall was not cruelty wearing the shape of law. It was simply a choice, hers to speak or not, on her own terms. For the first time in her life, they had mistaken her stolen silence for guilt. In the end, the crown fell quiet because Illyra Vale no longer needed it to speak for her.